As the U.S. Congress struggles to pass voting rights laws, how will this define Joe Biden's presidency? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. A political battle is raging in the United States over voting rights. Republicans across the United States have put rules and measures in place which Democrats say will suppress voting, especially for minorities. Democrats are fighting back. President Biden wants to pass sweeping voting rights reforms, which he says will make it easier for everyone to vote. The issue has sparked a fierce debate over the future of democracy in the United States. The Reverend Jesse Jackson is a veteran of the civil rights movement and a champion of minority rights. I asked him for his views on this critical issue and where he thinks the United States is heading.
We as the people are concerned that 246 years in slavery, 246. Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation after the war had begun in South Carolina, and then after 20 years we had the right to vote. Johnson, Lincoln was killed, put in a separate but equal apartheid, and we didn't get the right to vote till 65 years later. And so we are now just having the right to vote for the first time, really in almost 300 years. And now there's an attempt to cut back on it. The cut back on it, we got it in the 19th century. Attempt to cut back there, we're not going backwards.
You worked with Dr. Martin Luther King, you worked with people like John Lewis, people who gave up much, people who sacrificed for the right to vote. These were hard-won civil rights. You recently wrote in the Washington Informer that Democrats must act and act immediately against this threat. But if we look at what is going on right now, the threat to voting rights is very real. Efforts to stop it appear to be failing. How grave is the danger to voting rights, especially for minorities?
The right wing today and the Confederate spirit that's in there now, where the South is attempting to secede again in a psychological sense. I mean, these guys had an ideology. Jefferson Davis, slavery, secession, segregation, sedition, and white male supremacy. That's their frame of reference. That's backbone of their movement. That's what they believe. Now, we cannot let that happen. I think labor is much too silent, given Joe Manchin comes from sixth poorest state in the country. Labor has deep roots in the hills of Appalachia and Allegheny, Johnny Lewis and the miners. The industry is somewhat fading. A lot of people still using coal in our country. Who might die every 6 hours from black lung disease? Every 6 hours from black lung disease today. They need help. And he's turning down resources for his state. I think that labor, AFL, and civil rights organizations, maybe Stephen Wonder and Willie Nelson have a major rally in Charleston, West Virginia. Mr. Biden can't get his attention. One guy playing himself up against another guy. The people must speak. The lady in Senator in Arizona, she's a product of the civil rights movement. The women, the white women, should shout and speak out. She must be challenged by her women's constituency. Biden cannot make her move on a dime. She's part of invisible forces and dark money. So we don't know where she's come from, but the people must speak to her. I think that what's missing right now is organized labor in motion, and women movement on Manchin, on Senator. But she represents a threat to women's right to self-determination. Genetic, the whole movement is being jeopardized by this one woman, this one man from West Virginia.
What do you think is needed right now across the country for the country to change direction? I mean, you have written before about the role of young people.
This year, we should make every high school senior who's 18 who will be 18 by November, they'll register and vote. They need reduced college debt. They need free community colleges. Think about Joe mentioned West Virginia. Those coal mines, they need trade skill development. That's what the school is all about. And so those in college the right to vote, but vote where you intend to. If you're in Iowa and you live in school in Illinois, right to vote where you attend school, so that the youth movement can take on substances this time around. High school seniors can vote to reduce college tuition, debt, which is I talk with people all the time. Why are you a good nurse? Why don't you go to med school? I couldn't afford to go to med school. Couldn't afford the debt. We're losing talent because of the cost and the greed of a few. So young people must march. They may make big dormitories, must become precincts. And no matter what Trump does, you cannot take it away. We're on fire.
You were part of the Moral Monday protests, which were launched last July. In fact, you were among those arrested last year while protesting to end the filibuster, protect voting rights, and to raise the federal minimum wage up to $15 an hour. Are these protests going to continue?
Bishop Bob is very relentless in his quest to lift the plight of poor people. Dr. King's last campaign, poor people's campaign. He said we have public accommodation, had the right to use facilities, but poor people could not use them. Had the right to vote. Poor people didn't have a motivation to vote, and the drama leaves voter registration, as it did, and we had the struggle for the right to vote. And so I think he'll be happy that we've registered now millions of new voters. So there's now a black mayor in South Alabama where we blew the bridge. Birmingham, where the church was blown up, black mayor now. Same is true in Montgomery, Alabama, where the bus boycott began, in Mobile, Dallas, and Houston, right around the coast where the slave ships landed. Politically, we become involved. We must now have an economic movement where it's parallel that we're asking people in the top 100 cities to look at the 100 top corporations. We must have a social contract with them, focusing on what? On board of directors and C-suites, products, goods, and services and contracts. Let's not use our dollars as we use our votes.
Reverend Jesse Jackson, we wish you well, sir. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
That was the Reverend Jesse Jackson speaking with me from Chicago. Well, to continue our conversation, let's bring in our panel, all based in Washington, D.C. We have Melik Abdul, who is a political analyst and writer and Republican strategist. Douglas Sloan is a principal and senior analyst at the National Capital Strategy Group, and Eleanor Clift is a political columnist at the Daily Beast. Welcome to all of you. Great to have you with us. Eleanor Clift, it would seem that voting rights legislation is now dead. The Democrats made a vigorous effort to get this legislation passed, but they just don't have the votes, and that's because of something known as the filibuster. Before we look at the impact this is going to have on the Biden presidency, what is the filibuster?
Well, the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It is a rule adopted in the Senate, and it's been put in place to assure minority rights. And the idea is that you would need a supermajority to pass legislation, that 51 votes is not enough. You need 60, a supermajority, which operated modestly well over the decades. But the filibuster was used mainly to thwart civil rights legislation. Southern legislators, Republicans and Democrats, used it to stop civil rights legislation for quite a long period of time. And now, with the two parties so closely divided and the likelihood of getting 60 votes for anything when you have the Republicans currently refusing, for the most part, to give Biden votes on anything, even though one of these voting rights bills passed with, I think, 98 votes in the Senate in 2003, perhaps it was. There are 16 Republicans currently in the Senate who voted for this bill in the past, and the John Lewis voting rights bill, and now they're refusing. So it's become a political weapon, and Democrats are would like to either make an exception for voting rights legislation to preserve democracy, to allow this to go through with a majority vote, or they would like to end the filibuster completely. I think the filibuster will be gone eventually, but it may not be gone in time to save these voting rights bills.
So, Eleanor, as I was saying, it seems right now, with things the way they are, that the voting rights legislation is not going to pass. What kind of impact is this going to have on the Biden presidency at this stage?
Well, there are still plans to try to force a debate. The Republicans are actually even blocking any debate on the issue. And I think the Democrats would like to have a debate so that the country can see who's for these voting rights and who isn't. And one of the bills was actually fashioned by Senator Manchin, who's a leading moderate who works with the Republicans across party lines. And he is a co-sponsor of one of these voting rights bills. So I think the Democrats would just like the country to try to understand how hard they're fighting and what the obstacles are. And some of the obstacles are systemic. The 50 Democrats in the US Senate actually represent 41 million more voters than the 50 Republicans, because Democratic senators tend to come from the bigger population areas, the more urban states. The 50 Republicans, every state gets 2 senators. So 2 senators in California with 70 or 80 million people, 2 senators in Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Idaho, states which have such minimal population that they only have 1 representative in the House of Representatives. So there are systemic problems here, hurdles, if you will, that are they're very difficult for the Democrats to get over. I think they just want the country to understand what they're up against. And I think Biden needs to show, particularly voters of color to whom the history of the filibuster is very personal, because it was used basically to keep them from exercising the franchise. He wants them to know that he's on their side, he's fighting for them. It's about creating political energy going into elections later this year.
Melik Abdul, this is legislation about voting rights, reinforcing democracy, removing obstacles, making sure that people can go to the polls and vote. One would think that everybody would be on board with this. Everybody would support it. Everybody would agree with it. But why is there no support from Republicans for this?
I think part of the biggest problem, and I've actually been talking about this for a while, the biggest problem is that we're really, when we have these discussions about what people consider voter suppression, there is no real discussion about the actual examples. So what do I mean by that? Prior to 2020, many states, including Georgia and Delaware, did not have ballot boxes in the state. Well, what the actual the Georgia legislature did, they made ballot boxes permanent, but in places like Fulton County, which actually had a history of, problems at their polling and, getting out the information, turning in the ballots and everything, what was happening is that they actually lowered that number in Fulton County alone from 38 ballot boxes to 6 ballot boxes, but they made ballot boxes permanent. In the entire state of Delaware, there are 6 ballot boxes for the upcoming election cycle. What Georgia did really is consistent with what a lot of other states have actually done. The issue of voter ID, well, the problem with the criticism of that is that in 2005, Georgia actually implemented an in-person ID requirement. What they did as part of this legislation is that they extended the ID requirement to absentee ballots. So much like here in Washington, D.C., and in Delaware, in New York, in California, well, not California, but if you wanted to actually request an absentee ballot or vote by absentee ballot, you have to have your voter ID, either the last 4 of your social security number, a state issued ID, a utility bill, a bank statement, and many of these other things. So I'm saying all of this to say we need to have conversations about the examples that which people are actually referring to when they say voter suppression. Not allowing people to give water in line, but the poll worker actually can. That's not voter suppression. And no, none of these things have actually been challenged in court because courts have actually ruled on these things. So if it is voter suppression, there are mechanisms in the voting rights bill, which they actually reauthorized for, I think, 25 additional years during the Bush years. So these things, let's have conversations about the actual examples of voter suppression, and then let's say if maybe they shouldn't do this thing versus that thing,
Yeah.
but some of these things that they're talking about, it's not suppressing the actual vote.
All right, Douglas Sloan, what do you make of that? Is this a question of perception, how the two sides look at the same issue? And as Melik Abdul says, we need examples of why this could be referred to as voter suppression.
Oh, absolutely. It is definitely more than just one's outlook on voter suppression. The voter law changes in Georgia were so restrictive that Major League Baseball moved their All-Star game out of the state in protest. And like Malik had pointed out, they're saying that, you're not allowed to give food or water to people standing in line. I just don't understand what the purpose of that is. If you want people to vote and they're actually interested in voting, why are you making water a criminal substance? Why is it illegal to hand out water? It just doesn't make any sense. Of course, that is going to restrict people or suppress people from voting. Of course, that is voter suppression. The 19 states over just the past year, since 2020, have enacted restrictive voter laws. Georgia, Texas, I believe Oklahoma, throughout the country. So we're definitely seeing a push to try to restrict various people from voting. And, a lot of this really comes down to the browning of America. As we see growth in minority populations, we are seeing Republican legislatures push to have much more restrictive access to the ballot. They don't want these people voting. And it's really mind-blowing that instead of competing for these new voters with the Democratic Party, the GOP would rather restrict their voting access. So this is not something that is made up. This is not something that is we're imagining. This is very real. And in terms of different examples, he said, "Well, take a look at what voter suppression really is." In Pennsylvania, the GOP legislature now wants to appoint a partisan board to count the votes and to make up the voting districts. In Pennsylvania, those voting districts usually lean in Republicans' favor, but this last redistricting was not enough, and they want much more restrictive districts that will restrict blacks and other minorities from voting. And we're seeing this overall push from Republican legislatures ever since Trump was in office to restrict voting of black and brown communities. So this is very real. And it is because of this reason that we are seeing all of this discussion around voting rights. It is because of this that we are discussing this, that Biden is making a move to enact the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and even Manchin's bill, I think the Freedom to Vote Act. Yeah. But we're getting pushback from the Republicans. Not one single Republican senator will vote in favor of these acts. And I think that that's very telling.
Eleanor Clift, let's get back to the politics of this. There appears to be some dissension within the Democratic Party itself on strategy and how to enact these laws. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, they went to Atlanta last week to campaign for the legislation, but the African-American Democratic leadership in Georgia, including Stacey Abrams, who's running for the Democrats for governor of that state, were absent. They were not there. They did not meet with the president. What's behind this?
Well, if Joe Biden's poll ratings were 50% instead of 43%, Stacey Abrams would have been at that event. She's running for governor of Georgia, a rematch against the current sitting governor. And she concluded that appearing with President Biden wasn't going to help her. So I think that was a tactical decision on her part. She, like many progressive activists, thinks that the president should have come out and made the speeches that he made this week, should have made them months earlier, and put more of his political capital, when he had political capital, behind the issue. But going forward, how does it affect Biden? I think he wants Democrats in particular to recognize that he is doing everything he can, and he wants to point the fingers at the holdouts. Now, Senator Manchin from West Virginia, Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, they are opposed to reforming the filibuster, altering it. Initially, the thought was that they would back some sort of reform, a talking filibuster. Originally, when the filibuster first started, if you wanted a filibuster, you had to get up on the Senate floor and you had to talk and talk and talk. But that was inconvenient to modern day senators who want to catch airplanes back home on Thursday afternoon. So that was, both parties agreed. All you have to do is say, I'm filibustering, and if you have enough senators in your party, it brings everything to a halt. And the filibuster is now really widely abused, and it's not a good look for the Democrats to be fighting among themselves,
Right.
and to have two holdouts, and there may be more senators who don't want to change the filibuster. And their argument is, if we change the filibuster and we can pass voting rights or whatever we want to pass with 50 votes plus the vice president, then the Republicans can come in and enact their agenda, and they'll do the same thing to us. Well, if the Republicans take power and they want to get something done, they're going to change the filibuster in a nanosecond, because that's what the Republican leader did. He changed the filibuster so that you didn't need 60 votes to confirm Supreme Court justices. We now have 3 Trump justices on the Supreme Court. So I think, predicating what you do today on what the Republicans might or might not do when they gain power, and everybody respects the power that Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, is willing to exert. So I have no doubt if the Republicans wanted to pass something, they would get rid of the filibuster in a New York minute, I guess would be the phrase I would use.
Melik, I want to get back to some of the points that were raised by Douglas Sloan a moment ago. One of them was that what we're seeing here is a Republican response or a counter to what Douglas referred to as the Browning of America. That's one of the things. He also pointed out that there are 19 states which have passed or trying to pass legislation which Democrats say would suppress the vote. There have been some surveys done. An opinion poll survey recently said that 55% of American voters believe that there is something wrong, that there needs to be electoral reform.
Yeah. So actually, and I've said this many times before, we don't have really a layered discussions about this. So we take one thing particularly, or what's happening in one state, and say everything is voter suppression. So Democrats start at the idea that any change in voter or election laws is voter suppression. So what a lot of the states were actually doing because of the pandemic in Georgia and Florida and many of Texas and many of these other states, they actually implemented emergency measures such as the 24-hour voting that was available in Georgia, the ballot boxes that were all around the country. They actually did this in response to not being able to vote in person. Well, we're no longer at that point where we're not able to vote in person, so they've eliminated some of those emergency measures. But we don't have this larger conversation because we say, well, because in Georgia, they're no longer allowing line warming, which means that I can't get off of my NRA bus and hand out NRA water bottles to people standing in line. But if I wanted to actually give that to the poll workers themselves can actually do that. That's what's happening. In Georgia, Georgia actually has no excuse absentee voting, which means that you don't have to have a reason to request an absentee ballot in Georgia. In Delaware, Biden's home state of Delaware, you have to have a reason in order to request an absentee ballot. So like I said earlier, there are bits and pieces that people actually pull out to say this is voter suppression, but what it's not. It's not voter suppression. It's not Jim Crow. It's not many of these things that people have actually said that they were. And I think it's intellectual actually dishonest and not helpful for us to, when we don't have these much larger conversations about the real life examples and impacts. Because at the end of the day, if these things are disproportionately impact Black and brown people, there are legal mechanisms in order to actually deal with that.
Douglas Sloan, does Melik have a point there that there is this very uneven application of voting laws around the country, and of course states are responsible for these voting laws, but the example that he pointed out, for instance, was that you don't need to come up with any kind of excuse to cast an absentee ballot in Georgia, but you do need to do that in a state like Delaware, which is President Biden's home state.
Well, Melik brought up a number of different examples there. One being, handing out NRA water. The law in Georgia doesn't say that, you can't hand out water that has a particular political endorsement on it. It just says you can't hand out water, which is quite frankly draconian. They could have put in the law that you can't hand out water with any political paraphernalia or writing on it, but it just says water. So that in of itself actually makes water an illegal substance, which is ridiculous. And when we're getting down to another point that he made, hey, we made these changes because of COVID. Well, listen, a lot of those changes that they made, I admit, was to encourage people to vote. Please, we know we don't want you going out to these polls and catching COVID, but we still need you to vote. That's a good thing. In this republic that we have that's based on the model of a representative democracy, that people are actually getting out and voting and are taking part in our democracy. In Oregon, they actually just have full-time mail-in voting. Perish the thought that we actually keep laws in place and encourage people to have laws to get more people to get out and vote. And I think with the discussion that we're just, the whole discussion that's being framed there is that we don't believe as Democrats, we don't believe that it's a good thing to do anything to restrict voting. That, even if I were to take his point at face value, well, we're just going back to where it was. Well, why is it necessary?
Okay.
We need as many people to participate in this representative democracy as possible, and voting is the very foundation and the principal way to do that. So please, we need people to get out and vote, and we want as many people to participate as possible.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. That's been The Heat. Thanks for watching.